Please, save my heir. Lucian's voice, the same voice that had once ordered armies to their deaths without a tremor, cracked on the last word. He was kneeling, in the snow, in front of a bus stop sign that read, "Next bus, eternal night," as if the city itself were mocking the life draining out of the bundle in his arms. Clara Evans sat very still on the bench, her hands folded in her lap. A hospital bracelet she couldn't bring herself to cut off, still looped around her wrist. She hadn't looked up when the knights arrived. She hadn't looked up when the king knelt. She only looked up when she heard the baby. 3 weeks. That's how long it had been since Lily. 3 weeks, and her body still hadn't gotten the message. She woke every morning in pain, milk arriving for a daughter who never would. She'd handed in her resignation at the hospital that morning. She couldn't stand another shift of healthy babies crying in the next room. Tonight she was leaving the city for good. One bag at her feet, nothing left to lose, and no one left to lose it to. Then Cale's cry reached her, thin, fading, barely a cry at all, and something in Clara moved before her mind caught up. She was on her feet before she'd decided to stand. "Give him to me, before we go further." Where are you watching from tonight? Drop it below, subscribe if you haven't, and stay close, because what Clara is about to walk into will change everything she thought she knew about loss, love, and the price of a second chance. 3 days earlier, Blackthorn Castle had gone silent. Not the silence of peace, the silence of a kingdom holding its breath. Queen Seraphina had died, bringing Cale into the world, and in the 6 centuries, Lucian had ruled both feared and unchallenged. Nothing had ever touched him the way her absence did. He was 648 years old and looked no older than 33, silver hair, a black velvet cloak he hadn't changed in days, a face carved by a will that had never once been broken. Until now, Cale wouldn't feed. Not from enchanted milk, not from blood elixirs, not from any of the 7 healing rituals the royal physicians had tried since sunrise. The prince's cries had gone from furious to faint, and the physicians had finally said the words no one in the castle was prepared to hear. Less than an hour. It was the oracle who remembered the old prophecy, buried in scrolls no one had opened in a century. Only the arms of a grieving human mother, one who had lost her own newborn, could call Cale back from the edge before the midnight bell. Lucian didn't wait for a translation of what that meant. He was already moving the Crimson Guardians, Draven Cassius Ronan Elias, falling in step behind him, out through the gates, and into the human world. Chasing a name, the oracle had barely finished speaking before the king was gone. He found her at a bus stop in the snow, 3 minutes before her last bus out of the city. For the first time in 600 years, Lucian knelt in front of someone. He begged, and Clara, who had spent 3 weeks believing there was nothing left in her worth needing, reached out and took his son into her arms like she'd been waiting for him without knowing it. The bus pulled away without her. She didn't watch it go. She would think, much later, that she should have asked more questions. Who these men were, where the castle banners came from, why the guards standing behind the king wore armor forged for a war she'd never heard of. But in that moment, none of it mattered, because Cale's fingers had curled weakly but unmistakably around the collar of her coat, and Clara Evans hadn't felt a baby's grip in 3 weeks. She looked down at him, and for one unbearable second, she saw Lily's face instead of his. Then his eyes opened, and the moment was only entirely his. The world tilted the moment they stepped past the bus stop's edge. 1 second Clara was standing on cracked pavement, with Cale against her chest, snow catching in her eyelashes. The next, the city was gone, swallowed by a curtain of shadow that rippled like water, and she was standing in a courtyard of black stone beneath a sky so full of stars it didn't look real. She didn't scream. She was too tired to scream, and Cale was too warm and too alive in her arms for her to care how she'd gotten here. "A portal," Lucian said, watching her face carefully, as though bracing for panic. "It will not hurt you again." "I should have warned you." "You should have," Clara agreed. Then she looked past him and forgot to be annoyed. Blackthorn Castle rose in front of her like something carved rather than built. Towers stacked on towers, black banners hanging heavy and wet with old snow, red sigils glowing faintly where torchlight touched them. It should have terrified her, Instead, standing there with a dying baby's heartbeat starting to even out against her palm, she felt strangely calm. There was nothing left in her that fear could reach anymore. Inside, the halls were colder than the courtyard, not in temperature, in feeling. Servants moved along the corridors with their heads down, footsteps quiet, voices quieter. A young woman carrying folded linens flinched when Lucian passed, pressing herself flat against the wall like she was trying to disappear into the stone. An older man polishing a suit of armor didn't look up at all. Grief lived in this castle, the way smoke lives in a house after a fire. Clara had seen it before, in hospital hallways after a code blue, that particular hush that falls over a place when everyone is afraid of making things worse by speaking. "They loved her," Clara said quietly. It wasn't a question. Lucian's jaw tightened. Everyone loved Serafina. She was. He stopped himself, the way people did when a sentence led somewhere they weren't ready to go. The nursery is this way. The nursery was warmer than the rest of the castle, lit gold instead of blue, but it still carried the same held-breath quality. A cradle sat untouched in the corner, its blankets pristine, clearly never slept in. Clara didn't ask. She sat in the chair, Lucian pulled forward and settled Kale against her. And within a minute the room's only sound was the small, steady rhythm of a baby finally feeding. Lucian stood in the doorway and watched like he was afraid that looking away would break the spell. "I want to discuss compensation," he said eventually, formal in the way people get when they don't know how to say thank you. "There's no need." "There is." He came further into the room, and for the first time she saw him without the crown, without the weight of an audience, just a tired man in a rumpled cloak. "Gold. Land, if you want it. Anywhere in the kingdom. Protection for the rest of your life, and beyond it, if such a thing can be arranged. A title, if that matters to you. Name it, and it is yours." Clara looked down at Kale's face, slack now with the particular piece of a fed infant, and thought about Lily's nursery, still packed in boxes in her apartment because she hadn't been able to make herself donate the crib. "I don't want your gold," she said, "or your land, or a title. Then what do you want?" She looked up at him. "Nothing. I'm staying because he needs me. That's it. That's the whole reason." Lucian didn't say anything for a long moment. It was the kind of silence Clara recognized from grieving parents at the hospital. The silence of someone recalibrating what they thought they understood about people. "No one has refused me anything in 600 years, he said finally, and there was something almost like humor buried under the exhaustion in his voice. "Well," Clara adjusted the blanket around Kale's shoulders. "There's a first time for everything, Your Majesty." Over the next hour, something in the castle began, very slightly, to unclench. A servant girl, no older than 20, with anxious eyes and flour-dusted sleeves that reminded Clara uncomfortably of nothing she could place, brought a tray of tea and bread without being asked, then lingered at the door, watching Kale feed with an expression somewhere between disbelief and hope. "He's been so quiet," the girl said softly. "We were all afraid to hope. What's your name?" "Nessa, my lady." "I'm not a lady, Nessa. My lady. I'm not a lady, Nessa. I'm a nurse." Clara smiled, and Nessa's shoulders came down half an inch, like she'd been given permission to breathe. By the time Kale drifted into real sleep, not the fitful half-consciousness of a starving infant, but deep, easy sleep, 3 more servants had found reasons to pass by the nursery door. An older woman touched the door frame like a blessing before moving on. A guard, easily 7 feet tall in his black armor, paused just long enough to look at the prince and exhale something that sounded suspiciously like relief. Lucian noticed all of it. Clara caught him watching not her, and not entirely Kale either. Watching the servants, watching the way fear was loosening its grip on his own house for the first time since Serafina died. He looked for a moment, like a man remembering what his home used to sound like. "You did that," he said quietly, nodding toward the doorway Nessa had just left through. "I fed a baby. You did more than that." He didn't explain further, and Clara didn't push. It was near midnight when Clara rose to lay Kale in the cradle, exhaustion finally catching up to her all at once. She reached for the shelf of feeding supplies to set out what she'd need for the next round, and stopped. Behind the neat row of enchanted bottles the healers had been using, pushed to the back of the shelf, half hidden behind a folded cloth, sat 3 more, unmarked. Slightly different in color than the others, a faint wrong tint to the glass, like something added that shouldn't have been there. Clara picked one up, turning it slowly in the low light, and felt the calm of the evening drain out of her all at once. Clara set the strange bottle back exactly where she'd found it. She didn't say anything to Lucian that night. Not yet. It could be nothing, leftover supplies from a healer who'd since left service, some ritual ingredient she didn't understand. She'd spent 3 weeks learning that grief made people see danger in shadows that were only shadows. She wanted to be sure before she put that fear into a man who'd already lost too much. But she remembered where the bottles sat, and she didn't stop noticing. By the end of the first week, Clara had stopped thinking of herself as a guest. It happened without her deciding it. She woke early out of habit, nurses' hours, hospital hours, and found the nursery in a state that made her hands itch, supplies scattered across 3 different shelves feeding logs kept by memory instead of paper, blankets washed whenever someone remembered rather than on any kind of rotation. So she fixed it. She wrote out a schedule and pinned it to the wall. She sorted the shelf into labeled sections. She taught 2 of the younger servants how to properly sterilize bottles, how to wash their hands before touching kale, small things that made the older staff raise their eyebrows and the younger ones write down like scripture. "You run this nursery like a war room," Nessa told her, half laughing, arms full of folded linens. "I run it like a hospital ward. Same thing, most days." Word moved through the castle the way it always does in a place where everyone is starved for something to talk about. Besides grief, the human woman who'd saved the prince was now reorganizing the pantry logic of an immortal kingdom and doing it with a patience that made the servants forget, occasionally, to be afraid. She found the head cook arguing with a delivery boy over spoiled milk and offered to show him a rotation system her own bakery had used to cut waste in half. She found an old nursemaid crying quietly in a linen closet, not for Kale but for Seraphina, whom she'd served since the queen was a girl, and sat with her for 20 minutes saying almost nothing at all. Because Clara had learned in hospital hallways that most grief doesn't want to be fixed. It just wants a witness. By the second week, the castle smelled different. Bread again. Some mornings, when the cook felt bold enough to try, fewer hushed voices. More footsteps that didn't sound like they were trying to be invisible. The Crimson Guardians noticed before Lucian said a word about it. Draven, the tallest and quietest of them, took to standing near whatever room Clara occupied, arms crossed, watching the doorway like she was something worth guarding, even without an order to do so. He rarely spoke to her directly, but she caught him once, watching her scrub a feeding bottle with more focus than a man of his size should give something so small, and there was an expression on his face she didn't have a word for, something close to awe. Cassia's was easier to read. He appointed himself her unofficial tutor in all things vampire court etiquette, which servants held, which rank, why no one should ever offer a guardian food before a feast day. What it meant that Lucian had let a human sit at his own table. That last one, Cassius said, lowering his voice like it was a confidence, has not happened in longer than you would believe. Is that a compliment? It's a fact. Draw your own conclusions. Ronan, for his part, treated her arrival as an excuse for an endless supply of dry commentary. The prince is a nursemaid who alphabetizes bottles, he announced to the guard hall at large, and somehow this is the strangest thing that's happened here in 6 centuries. Elia said almost nothing at all, but she noticed he was the one who lingered longest near Kale's cradle when the others had gone, standing watch in a silence that felt less like duty and more like devotion. Lucian began joining her for meals on the 5th night. No announcement made, just his chair pulled up across from hers at the small table in the nursery's antechamber where she usually ate alone. "You don't have to do this," Clara said. "I'm aware." He didn't offer further explanation, and she didn't ask for one. They ate mostly in silence those first few nights, him watching her with the careful attention of a man relearning a language she'd once known. But the silences got shorter as the week went on, and by the 7th night, he was telling her unprompted about Seraphina's laugh and the way the castle used to smell like the gardens she kept before winter took them. Clara didn't fill that story with sympathy. She just listened. The way she'd learned to listen to parents in the worst hallways of her old life, and something in Lucian's shoulders came down an inch when she did. "You make it easier to be in this house," he said one night, so quietly she almost missed it. "I just fed a baby and reorganized a shelf. You did considerably more than that." He looked at her a beat too long before catching himself, and looked away first, which, from a man who hadn't looked away from anything in 600 years, felt like something. Clara told herself. She imagined the warmth that rose in her chest at that. She had no business feeling anything but gratitude toward a man whose world she didn't belong to, whose grief was only weeks old, whose son she'd sworn to help for exactly as long as he needed her, and not a moment longer. She was thinking about that, about the careful, sensible line she meant to hold, when she reached for the evening speeding bottle and caught the smell. Faint, almost nothing, but wrong. Not the clean, herbal scent the healer's enchanted milk usually carried. Something underneath it, sour and metallic, like rot pressed thin enough to almost hide. Clara set the bottle down without a word, her pulse picking up, and reached for the others on the shelf one by one, lifting each to her nose in the lamplight. 3 of them smelled exactly like they should, 2 did not. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small desk in the nursery's antechamber with the 2 wrong-smelling bottles wrapped in cloth and hidden at the bottom of her bag, and she made herself breathe slowly, the way she used to before delivering bad news to a family in a hospital corridor. Don't guess. Don't panic. Look at what's actually in front of you. What was in front of her was a healthy baby sleeping soundly for the first time in his short life, and 2 bottles that smelled like something had been added to them that didn't belong. In the morning, she didn't say anything to Lucian. Instead, she asked Nessa as casually as she could manage, where the feeding records were kept. The healer's ledger, my lady. In the East study. Nessa hesitated. Is something wrong? Just being thorough. Old habit. The ledger was thick, leather-bound, and, Clara noticed almost immediately, inconsistent in a way that made her stomach tighten. She'd spent years reading hospital charts, and charts told the truth even when people didn't mean them to. Handwriting changed page to page. Some entries were precise to the hour. Others were vague, rounded off, filled in later than they should have been. She found the week before her arrival and traced Cale's recorded feeding times against the healer's own notes on his condition. The pattern that emerged made her go still. Cale hadn't simply been sick. According to the earliest entries, he'd been improving, slowly but steadily, in the first 2 days after Serafina's death. Then, on the 3rd day, the entries shifted. A new hand took over half the notations. The feeding schedule changed, spaced further apart, at odd hours, deviating from what the earlier healer had clearly established as working. And that was the exact point where Cale's condition began its plunge toward the 1-hour warning that had sent Lucian into the snow. Someone changed the schedule, on purpose, right when he started getting better. She sat with that for a long moment, feeling the same cold clarity she used to feel reading a chart that didn't add up. The moment before you had to decide whether to trust your instincts or the paperwork in front of you. She went to the nursery that afternoon under the excuse of restocking supplies, and this time she looked at more than the shelf. The protective wards painted along the doorframe, faint gold lines Cassius had explained, kept malevolent magic from crossing the threshold, had a break in them. Small, easy to miss, unless you were looking. A single line interrupted where the gold paint had been scraped thin, like something had worn it down deliberately rather than by accident. Near the cradle, faint discoloration marked the floorboards, a residue Clara couldn't identify, dull and grayish, the kind of stain that wouldn't wash out no matter how many times someone scrubbed it. When she asked Cassius about it later, keeping her voice light, he frowned in a way that told her more than his answer did. Old rituals sometimes leave residue, he said, though I confess I don't recognize this particular kind. Should you? I've studied protective wardcraft for 200 years, Clara. I should recognize most things. He crouched to look closer, and for the first time since she'd met him, some of the easy humor left his face. I'll ask the healers. Don't, Clara said too quickly. He looked up at her. Not yet. I want to understand what I'm looking at before we make it anyone's business. Cassius studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, like he'd decided to trust an instinct he didn't fully understand himself. Lord Malachar found her that evening, in the corridor outside the nursery, and Clara understood immediately why the servants spoke of him with careful respect. He was tall, silver-templed, dressed in dark robes trimmed with a restraint that somehow read as more powerful than Lucian's velvet and jewels. His voice was warm, measured, the voice of a man who had spent centuries being the calm center of a room. "You're the young woman who saved our prince," he said, inclining his head. "The entire court is in your debt. I just fed a baby. You did considerably more, from what I hear." His smile reached his eyes, or seemed to. "I hope the castle has treated you well. It hasn't always been the warmest house, especially of late. Everyone's been very kind. Good." He glanced toward the nursery door, his expression softening into something that looked convincingly like grief. "Serafina and I were close, you understand. I served her father before her. Was everything I had left of that family." He caught himself on the word "was" and gave a small, rueful shake of his head. "Forgive me. Habits of an old, tired heart. I only want to see him safe, as I know you do." "I do," Clara said, and meant it. "Then we're allies in that, at least." He bowed his head again, unhurried, and moved on down the corridor, his footsteps fading into the quiet of the castle. Clara watched him go and told herself she had no reason to distrust him. He'd said nothing wrong. He'd been nothing but gracious, and yet something in her, the same instinct that had once told her a patient's chart didn't match what she was seeing at the bedside, refused to settle. It was well past midnight when she woke to check on Cale, some habit from the hospital keeping her on a rhythm no one had asked her to keep. The nursery was dark, lit only by the low ember glow of the fire. Cale slept soundly in his cradle, his breathing even. But the door to the healer's supply room, just off the nursery, stood open, a crack that hadn't been there an hour before. Clara went very still. A figure slipped out of it a moment later, cloaked, unhurried, careful in a way that read as deliberate rather than innocent, and moved down the corridor away from her, footsteps silent on the stone. She caught only a glimpse before the shadows swallowed them whole, but it was enough to know one thing for certain. Someone had been in that room who had no reason to be there at midnight, moving like they didn't want to be seen. Clara didn't sleep again that night. She sat by the fire long after the cloaked figure had vanished, turning the shape of them over in her mind. Height, gait, the particular unhurried confidence of someone who belonged in the castle and knew it, not a stranger, not an intruder in the way she'd first feared. Someone who lived here, someone who had every right to walk these halls at midnight and had chosen, still, to move like they didn't want to be seen. In the morning she told Cassius everything, the broken wards, the residue, the shifted feeding schedule, the figure in the dark. He listened, without interrupting, his usual easy humor gone entirely. "You should tell Lucian," he said finally. "I will. When I have more than a feeling, and 2 bottles that smell wrong. Clara, I've been wrong before, chasing a feeling. I won't accuse someone in this court without proof, not when the accusation alone could start a war." She met his eyes. "Help me find proof instead." Cassius studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There's a library, the old one, beneath the West Tower. Records going back further than even I've read. If someone tampered with wards and rituals, there may be a reason written down somewhere no one thinks to look anymore." The Royal Library was unlike anything Clara had seen. Shelves rising 3 stories into shadow, ladders on brass rails, the smell of old parchment and colder magic. Cassius led her past the sections open to court scholars, down a narrow stair, into a chamber where the books were older, the air stiller, the silence heavier in a way that made Clara lower her voice without meaning to. "The Oracle's prophecy," Cassius said, running a finger along a shelf of scrolls. "The one that led Lucian to you. It's recorded here. In full, supposedly. Though it's been centuries since anyone read past the first passage. He found it near the back. A scroll case sealed with wax gone brittle with age, the vampire royal crest pressed faintly into it. Inside, the parchment was fragile, the ink faded to a rust brown that made Clara lean close to read it all. The first lines matched what she already knew. A grieving mother, a dying heir, an embrace before the midnight bell. But the scroll continued. And there, near the bottom edge, the parchment had been torn. Not aged, not worn. Torn, deliberately, along a clean line that cut the final passage in half. "Someone removed part of this," Clara said quietly. Cassius's expression darkened. "That's not decay, that's theft." They searched for an hour before Cassius found the missing fragment, misfiled in a scroll case 3 shelves away. Whether by accident or design, neither of them could say. He read it once, silently, and went very still. Cassius. He handed it to her without a word. The old vampire script meant nothing to Clara, but Cassius translated it slowly, like each word cost him something. The prophecy didn't end with Cale's survival. It continued, describing a woman who would walk between 2 worlds that had hated each other for 1,000 years, and in walking between them, close the wound that had never healed. Not merely a savior of one child, a bridge, the beginning of an ending to a war older than the castle itself. That's not possible, Clara whispered. Prophecies rarely announce themselves as possible, Cassius said. They simply arrive, and then history decides what to do with them. She told Lucian that night, alone in his study, the torn fragment between them on the desk like something that might catch fire if handled wrong. He read it twice. Then he sat back, and for a long moment said nothing at all. Serafina believed in this oracle absolutely, he said finally. She would have called this fate. I've spent 6 centuries believing in very little beyond what I could hold a sword to. He looked up at Clara, and there was something raw in his face she hadn't seen since the bus stop. I don't know what to believe now. You don't have to believe anything tonight, Clara said gently. It's just parchment, Lucian. It doesn't change what's already true. That Cal is alive because of a choice we both made in the snow. It changes what people will expect of you. His voice was quiet. Of us. Clara didn't ask him what he meant by us. She wasn't sure she wanted the answer yet. Not with Serafina's absence, still sitting in every room of this castle like a held breath. Not with her own grief for Lily, still raw enough to catch her by surprise some mornings. But she saw the way he looked at her before he caught himself. The same look she'd noticed at their shared meals. Warmer now, harder to mistake for simple gratitude. And she didn't look away first this time. Word of the prophecy moved through the court faster than either of them intended. By the next evening, Clara felt the shift in every hallway she walked. Nobles who bowed a fraction too low, whispers that stopped when she entered a room and started again the moment she'd passed. Not everyone was pleased. A human woman, elevated by an ancient text, standing closer to the throne than any commoner in 1,000 years of vampire history. It was, to several of the older families, less a miracle than a threat. Lord Malachar moved through the unrest like a man determined to smooth it, offering calm reassurances at every turn, defending Clara's honor in the throne room with an eloquence that won murmurs of approval. But Clara noticed, more than once, how his private conversations with certain nobles fell silent the moment she came near, how the very families most opposed to her seemed to orbit closest to him at court. She told herself it meant nothing. Grief made people suspicious of shadows. She was still telling herself that 3 nights later, when she lifted her evening cup of spiced wine, a small courtesy from the kitchen meant to help her sleep, and caught beneath the cinnamon and warmth, the same faint, wrong metallic note she'd found in Cale's bottles. By the time she understood what she was smelling, the cup was already at her lips. Clara didn't swallow. Instinct. Pure, hospital-trained instinct turned her head at the last second, and the wine spilled across her sleeve instead of down her throat. She set the cup down with a hand that wasn't quite steady and stared at the dark stain spreading over the fabric, her heart slamming against her ribs. She didn't scream. She didn't call for anyone. She sat very still, the way she'd learned to sit still in the worst moments of her old life, and thought, someone in this castle just tried to kill me. She wrapped the cup carefully in a cloth, the way she had the bottles, and hid it beneath her bed. Then she sat awake until dawn, turning over every face she'd smiled at that week, wondering which of them had watched her lift that cup and waited. She went to Lucian first thing, and this time she told him everything. The bottles, the wards, the figure at midnight, the wine. She watched something in his face go cold and still in a way that frightened her more than anger would have. You should have told me the moment you found the bottles, he said. I didn't have proof. I have proof now. He looked at the stained sleeve of her dress, then at her face, and something in him seemed to break and reform at once. You could have died in my house, under my protection. His voice was low, controlled in the way she now recognized as the sound of him barely holding himself together. I won't allow it to happen again. Then help me find who did this, Clara said. Not guards standing outside my door. Answers. They investigated together after that, and something changed in the way they moved through the castle side by side. Not king and guest anymore, but two people chasing the same shadow. Lucian pulled records Clara had no authority to request. Clara noticed details his 6 centuries of court life had trained him to overlook. The ordinary things, the schedules, the small domestic inconsistencies that told the truth better than any ledger of magic. It was Draven who found the tunnel. He'd been assigned, quietly, to watch the servants' corridors near the nursery, and 3 nights into his vigil he found a section of wall in the old wine cellar that didn't sit flush, the way stone should. Behind it, a passage, narrow and cold, leading down further than any map of the castle accounted for. "I didn't go in alone," he told Lucian and Clara grimly. "I'm not fool enough for that, but I saw enough." What lay beyond the tunnel, when Lucian led a small party down at last, was a laboratory no one in the castle had known existed. Shelves of ingredients Cassius identified with visible horror as forbidden even by the oldest vampire law. Diagrams of ritual magic scrawled across the walls in a hand, none of them recognized, and in a locked cabinet, dozens of scrolls that matched in style and seal, the missing pages from the prophecy Clara had found in the library. Ronan, for once, had nothing dry to say. Elias found the ledger. It was smaller than the healer's official record, hidden beneath a loose floor stone, and it documented something that made Clara's stomach turn to ice as Cassius read it aloud. A precise, methodical account of altered rituals, substituted ingredients. Feeding schedules deliberately corrupted. Dates that matched. Exactly. The days Kale's condition had worsened. And further back, dates that matched something none of them had thought to question until now. The night Seraphina died. "This isn't only about Kale," Cassius said quietly, setting the ledger down like it might burn him. "Whoever did this began before he was even born. The Queen's labor complications, the physicians called it fate. This says otherwise." Lucian didn't speak for a long time. When he did, his voice was barely audible. "Someone murdered my wife." The Crimson Guardians spent the following days moving through the court in ways no one noticed until it was already done. Watching, listening, tracing coin and loyalty through the noble houses that had grumbled loudest against Clara's rise. What they found formed a pattern too consistent to be coincidence, a web of favors, debts, and quiet promises, all of it circling back again and again to Lord Malachar. He had built himself a following, not loud, not visible. The kind of loyalty built slowly, over years, through gifts remembered and grudges nursed. Nobles who owed him their positions, servants who owed him their silence, a patient, decades-long architecture of influence hiding beneath a mask of grief and service. None of it, on its own, was proof of murder. All of it, together, was proof of something Clara no longer had any doubt about. She said as much to Lucian on the 6th night, standing in his study with the ledger between them, the fire burning low. "It's him! It has to be! We need more than suspicion," Lucian said, though the look on his face told her he'd already stopped doubting it himself. "If I accuse Malachar without absolute proof, and I'm wrong, I hand every noble who resents you a reason to call it persecution. If I'm right and he learns we're close, he'll run. Or worse." Clara finished the thought for him. They agreed, that night, to move carefully. One more piece of proof, something undeniable, something that would leave no noble house room to defend him. And they'd bring it before the full court together. Clara thought she knew where to find it. A supply requisition she'd noticed days earlier, filed under a healer's name she now suspected didn't exist, tied to a storeroom in the old East Wing she hadn't yet searched. She didn't tell Lucian where she was going. She told herself it was because she wasn't certain yet, because she didn't want to raise his hopes on a hunch, because she'd always preferred to be sure before she spoke. She left a note on her desk instead, brief, unfinished, promising to explain everything by morning, and slipped out into the dark corridors alone. By the time Lucian found the note, Clara Evans was already gone. Clara had made it halfway down the East Wing corridor when the cloth came over her mouth. She fought. Years of hospital shifts had given her more strength than people expected. But whoever held her was vampire fast and vampire strong, and the world went dark before she could land a single useful blow. She woke to stone. Cold, damp, ancient stone. The air thick with the smell of earth, and something underneath it that made her skin crawl. Torchlight flickered against walls carved with symbols she didn't recognize, older than anything she'd seen in the library above. Her wrists were bound, her head throbbed, and beside her, in a cradle that had clearly been carried down for exactly this purpose, Cale was crying. No, Clara pulled against the ropes, ignoring the pain until she could reach him, until her bound hands found his small, furious, terrified body and pulled him close. He quieted almost instantly against her, the way he always did, and some small mercy in her chest loosened even as the rest of her went cold with fear. "He does prefer you," said a voice from the shadows. "I'll admit, that surprised me. I didn't expect the bond to hold this strongly. Prophecy is rarely so literal." Lord Malachar stepped into the torchlight, and the warmth Clara had once mistaken for kindness was gone entirely from his face. What remained was something patient and cold, a man who had waited centuries and saw no reason to hurry now. "You," Clara said. "Me." He didn't bother denying it, which frightened her more than a lie would have. "Sit. You're not going anywhere, and there's no use wasting your strength on rope you can't break." He told her everything, unhurried, almost proud, the way people confess to things they've never had the chance to say aloud. He had served Seraphina's father and her father's father before, that watched the Blackthorn line rule for centuries, while his own family's claim, older he insisted, older and more rightful, was buried in histories no one bothered to read anymore. He had waited. He had built loyalty, quietly, patiently, the way Draven and the others had uncovered. And when Seraphina's pregnancy gave him an opening, he had taken it. Her death wasn't an accident, he said, watching Clara's face for the horror he clearly wanted to see. A corrupted ritual, administered by a healer who owed me his family's freedom. Simple. Once you know which strings to pull. And Cale. Clara's voice shook, but she kept her chin up. "You tried to kill a newborn. I tried to end a bloodline that has ruled longer than it deserved." He said it simply, without apology. The boy's death would have broken Lucian entirely. Enough that the throne would fall to whoever could hold the kingdom together in his grief. Me, as it happens. His eyes flicked to her, cool and assessing. "You were an inconvenience I didn't plan for. The prophecy woke something in him I intended to be dead by now. So I adjusted. The wine. A clumsy attempt. I'll admit that too." He almost smiled. "You're more careful than I expected, Clara Evans." "It's a shame, really. Under different circumstances, I might have admired you." Clara held Cale tighter and said nothing, because every word she had left in her was rage, and rage wouldn't get her out of these ropes. It didn't take long for Lucian to come. Clara heard him before she saw him, the sound of the catacomb entrance giving way, the Crimson Guardians' voices echoing down stone corridors, Draven's shout carrying fury she'd never heard from him before. Then Lucian himself, stepping into the torchlight, and for the first time since the bus stop, Clara saw him look truly, entirely afraid. "Malachar." Lucian's voice was a blade with no edge softened. "Let them go. You always did prefer the direct approach." Malachar stood unhurried between them, a knife appearing in his hand almost casually, held not toward Clara, but toward the cradle, toward Cale. "I'll make this simple, old friend. You will kneel here before your own guardians and surrender the crown to me. You will sign the succession scrolls I've already prepared, and in exchange, I'll let the woman and the boy walk out of this castle unharmed. And if I refuse," Malachar's expression didn't change, "then I finish what I started 3 days after Seraphina died, and you'll have lost everything for nothing." Behind Lucian, Draven's hand went to his sword. Cassius shifted his weight. Ready. Ronan's easy humor had vanished entirely, replaced by something lethal and still. Elias hadn't taken his eyes off the cradle since he'd entered. Lucian looked at Clara, bound, holding his son against her chest, blood from a shallow cut at her temple where she'd struggled against her captors, and something in his face settled into a terrible, absolute calm. "You mistake me," he said quietly. "I have knelt exactly once in 600 years. In the snow. Before a woman who owed me nothing and gave me everything anyway." His eyes never left Malachar's face. "I will not kneel for you, then you'll watch them die." "No," Lucian drew his sword, the sound of steel ringing off the ancient stone like a bell. "You will not touch either of them again. Not while I stand, and not after, Because every guardian in this castle will hunt down anyone who tries. You have built yourself a following out of decades of patience, Malachar. I am about to show you what 6 centuries of restraint looks like when it finally ends." He turned just slightly toward the men beside him, Draven, Cassius, Ronan, Ilias, each already moving into position around the chamber. "This is war," Lucian said, loud enough for every shadow in the catacombs to hear. "Take back my son. Take back the woman who saved him. Malachar dies tonight or I do." Malachar's calm flickered. Just once. At the sound of blades being drawn on every side of him, Clara pulled Cal closer, pressed her lips to his small, damp forehead, and watched the king she had knelt for once, and who had knelt for her, step forward into the fight of his life. The catacombs erupted. Malachar's followers came out of the shadows like they'd been waiting for exactly this moment. A dozen vampire warriors in blackened armor, ancient enough that their blades still carried runes from an age before Blackthorn Castle had a name. The chamber, torchlit and narrow, became a storm of steel and shouted commands, echoing off stone that hadn't heard violence in centuries. Draven took the first 3 head-on, his sword a blur, driving them back toward the tunnel mouth with a fury Clara had only ever seen him hold in check. One of Malachar's men swung wide, aiming to flank him, and Draven caught the strike on his forearm guard and answered with a blow that ended the fight before it began. He didn't look back to see it land. He was already moving to the next. Cassius fought differently, precise, almost scholarly, reading his opponent's old-world forms before they finished their first strike and answering with counters 2 centuries out of date and impossible to predict. "You trained under Voss," he said to one warrior, parrying easily. He always favored the low guard. Predictable even then. His blade found the gap a heartbeat later. Ronan laughed through the entire fight, the sound sharp and humorless. 600 years and you people still haven't learned to duck. He called out, ducking a blow himself and driving his shoulder into a warrior twice his size, sending him sprawling into a wall of ancient runes that cracked, sparked, and exploded outward in a burst of pale fire. The warrior didn't get back up. Elias never left the cradle's side. 2 of Malachar's men tried for it together, and Elias met them both without a word, silent and merciless, a wall between the fighting and the child he guarded from the first night. Clara arrived. Lucian went straight for Malachar. Their swords met once, twice, the ring of steel nearly lost beneath the chaos filling the chamber. Malachar fought with the cold precision of a man who'd spent decades planning for exactly this confrontation. Every strike calculated, every retreat measured. "You could still surrender," Malachar said, breathing hard, blocking a blow that would have taken his head. "Save your guardians. Save yourself. You murdered my wife." Lucian's voice was almost calm, which was somehow worse than rage. "You tried to murder my son. There is no version of tonight where you leave this chamber breathing." He drove Malachar back a full step, then another, steel screaming against steel. Clara had been working her wrists against the rope since the fighting began, using the chaos as cover, ignoring the raw burn where the fibers cut skin. The knot had loosened just enough during the struggle down here. Sloppy work, done in haste by whoever had bound her, and with one hard, desperate wrench, her hands came free. She didn't run. She couldn't. Not with Cal crying again in the cradle a few feet away, not with the fight raging between her and any exit. She crawled toward him instead, low, keeping to the shadows along the wall, reaching the cradle just as Malachar broke free of Lucian's guard for half a second, just long enough to see her. Something changed in his face. Cold calculation gave way, for the first time, to pure desperation. "If I fall," Malachar said, loud enough to carry, "the bloodline falls with me." He hurled the spear. Clara didn't think. There was no time to think, no time to calculate distance or risk. Only the sight of the cursed weapon spinning through torchlight straight toward the cradle where Cale lay screaming, small and helpless and utterly unable to save himself. She threw herself over him. The spear struck her side with a force that emptied the world of sound. She felt it before she understood it. A white, blinding pain that stole the breath from her lungs, followed almost instantly by a cold that had nothing to do with the catacomb air. Spreading outward from the wound like frost across glass, she curled around Cale anyway, shielding him with what was left of her strength, and felt his small hands find her sleeve and grip. "Clara," Lucian's voice tore through the chamber, raw and broken, and whatever remained of his restraint went with it. He turned on Malachar with a violence that ended the fight in 4 strikes. The last one took Malachar through the chest, and the vampire lord's eyes went wide with something like disbelief that after all his patience, all his decades of careful architecture, it should end this simply, this fast. The moment his body hit the stone, the cursed magic threaded through the spear shattered. Clara felt it happen. A pulse of released pressure that rippled outward through the catacombs, extinguishing half the torches, sending dust raining from the ceiling as ancient runes along the walls flared once, violently, and went dark forever. Cale's crying stopped. His small hand was still fisted in Clara's sleeve, and when Lucian reached them, dropping to his knees on the stone, the prince turned his face toward his father and made a sound that was almost, impossibly, a laugh. Cale was unharmed. Clara was not. "Clara, Clara, look at me." Lucian's hands hovered over the wound, helpless in a way 6 centuries of power had never prepared him for. Blood soaked through her dress, dark and spreading, and her breathing had gone thin and shallow. "He's okay," she managed, the words costing her more than they should have. That's what matters. You matter." Lucian's voice broke on the words. "Do you understand me? You matter." The catacomb groaned around them, stone shifting somewhere deep in the collapsing structure where the shattered magic had left its foundations unstable. Above them, the guardians were already fighting their way clear, the last of Malachar's followers scattering or falling. Lucian didn't wait for the ceiling to decide their fate for them. He gathered Clara against his chest with one arm. Cale cradled against his other shoulder, and rose to his feet as dust and debris began raining down around them in earnest. "Hold on," he said to both of them, to either of them, and ran for the light. Clara woke slowly, the way she had every morning for 2 weeks now, to sunlight filtering through curtains someone had learned to leave open for her, and the quiet ache in her side that was, finally, more memory than pain. The healers said it was close to a miracle, how fast she'd recovered from a wound that should have killed her outright. Cassius had a theory about the prophecy, about magic recognizing its own, that he never quite finished explaining because Ronan always interrupted with something dry enough to make Clara laugh instead of ask questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Whatever the reason, she was alive, and Kel was thriving, and Blackthorn Castle had begun, slowly, to breathe again. Lucian visited every day. He rarely stayed long. A king had a kingdom to steady, a court still reeling from Malachar's betrayal, nobles who needed reassurance that the bloodline they'd sworn to was secure. But he always came, and he always sat a while at the edge of her bed with Cale in his arms. And Clara had stopped pretending to herself that she didn't wait for those visits more than any of the healers' rounds. The court gathered 3 weeks after the catacombs, in the great hall Clara had only glimpsed once. On her first disoriented night in the castle, it looked different now. Banners repaired, torches burning steady and bright, the hush of grief replaced by something that felt, cautiously, like anticipation. Clara stood beside the throne, still favoring her healing side. Kel settled on her hip because he'd started fussing the moment anyone else tried to hold him. Every noble house in the kingdom filled the hall below, and Clara felt the weight of every eye on her, some curious, some still uncertain. A few, the ones who'd once whispered in corners with Malachar, carefully unreadable. Quote, "Lucian rose 3 months ago," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without effort, the voice of a man who had commanded rooms for 6 centuries. "I knelt in the snow before a woman who owed this kingdom nothing, and I begged her to save my son. She did not ask what I could give her. She did not ask who I was or what danger she was stepping into. She simply held out her arms." He looked at Clara, and something in his expression made the whole hall go still. "She saved my son," he said. "She saved my kingdom from a threat none of us saw coming, hidden inside our own walls. She gave this castle back its warmth after I had forgotten what warmth felt like. Whoever honors the Blackthorn crown," Lucian said, his voice ringing clear through the silent hall, "shall honor Clara Evans." One by one, the nobles knelt, Draven first, then Cassius, then Ronan with a wink. Clara barely caught before he lowered his head. then Elias, then house after house after house, until the entire hall had bent the knee to a pediatric nurse from a city she'd once thought she'd never see again. "Guardian, mother of the vampire kingdom," Lucian announced, and Clara, holding his son against her chest, understood for the first time that whatever this new life was, she wasn't leaving it. 1 year later, the castle didn't look like the place Clara had first stepped into through a tear in the world. The banners still bore the blackthorn crest, but they hung now beside a second sigil Lucian had commissioned himself, human and vampire symbols entwined, a quiet, permanent statement stitched into every hall. Cale ran now, more than walked, chasing Ronan's boots down the corridors with a shrieking laugh that had become the castle's most common sound. He was healthy in every way the healers could measure, and in every way Clara measured too, bright-eyed, stubborn, endlessly curious about a world his mother had helped make safe for him. The Serafina Children's Sanctuary had opened in the castle's eastern wing that spring, named for the Queen Clara had never met, but had come, somehow, to feel she owed a great deal to. Human orphans and vampire orphans slept under the same roof, now fed by the same kitchens taught by the same gentle staff Clara had trained herself, and on quiet mornings she liked to walk the sanctuary halls and watch two worlds that had feared each other for 1,000 years learn slowly to simply be children together. Lucian had spent the year undoing centuries of walls between the human world and his own. Treaties signed, borders opened, old fears dismantled one patient conversation at a time. He never did it alone. Clara stood beside him at every table, not because the prophecy demanded it, but because he asked her to, every time, and she never once considered saying no. On the anniversary of that first snowy night, Clara stood on the moonlit balcony above the castle gardens, Cale's small hand wrapped around one of her fingers as he leaned against her leg, half asleep on his feet. He looked up at her suddenly, sleepy and soft, and reached both arms toward her. "Mama," he said. Clara's breath caught. She lifted him without a word, holding him close, feeling something in her chest finally, fully mend. "You never replaced Serafina," Lucian said quietly, stepping onto the balcony behind her. "I want you to know that. You couldn't have, and I wouldn't have wanted you to try. But you honored her, Clara. You saved everything she loved most in this world." Clara turned to face him, Cale drowsy against her shoulder, and found Lucian already kneeling. Not desperate this time, not begging for a miracle, but steady, certain, his eyes never leaving hers. "Will you stay?" he asked. "Not as Cale's guardian, as my queen." Clara looked down at him, at the man who had once knelt in the snow with nothing left to offer but his son's life in his own trembling hands, and felt the answer rise in her before she'd even finished deciding it. "Yes," she said. Dawn broke over Blackthorn Castle as they stood together on the balcony, Lucian, Clara, and Cale between them. The first sunrise in centuries that didn't carry the weight of morning, but something the castle hadn't known in a very long time, the quiet, certain beginning of a family and a future finally whole.